You're ready.
Yeah. Okay, thank you everyone for joining in at this session for the Azure Community APEX session. And today we will be talking about Microsoft Hybrid Approach. So we have our speaker, Jayant Dattari, who is going to be helping us better understand the topic and help us do some demos and yeah, do it on our own. And today we will have 1 hour session and that will be recorded. And secondly, there is certificate of participation to those who stay till the end. So that's two main other things that you need to be knowing if you're not never joined our sessions. That's basically it from my side, and the stage is all to join to get started.
Hey, thank you so much, Surag. I hope everybody can see my screen. Just give me a thumbs up if you can. All right. Okay, great. All right. So thank you, Surag. Thank you for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. I would love to speak at various events, which I do, part of my job as well. But I'll tell you a little bit about my profile before we begin. So I'm based out of Sydney. Been with Dell for the last 15 years now. I'm also a Microsoft MVP under the Azure Hybrid portfolio, which is the Azure Hybrid category. Yeah, so just sort of the MVP summit recently held at Redmond, and those who are aspiring to become MVPs, feel free to send me a message. I would be more than happy to kind of help you out. We would love more MVPs in the community to spread the awareness about the Microsoft technology. All right, so what's on the agenda today? Um, all right, now everybody knows about Azure. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about Azure, but we're going to speaking about what that lies outside of Azure. So, but still, why do people really care about Azure? That's something that let's try and understand. Um, and like I said, is there a world that exists outside of Azure or public cloud? Because when you speak to a lot of these customers, they're like, hey, you know what? I've moved everything to the public cloud because somebody asked me to move, right? Either Microsoft asked them to move, or AWS asked them to move, or Google asked them to move. They just moved. Well, that's not always the answer, but I think it basically depended on the customer's ease of managing their resources. They found it very, very easy to kind of just pay for what they consume and get out when they wanted to. So it is fairly very, very easy proposition, right? So that's one of the reasons what attracted a lot of industries towards public cloud, right? But in this session, we're going to explore, can everybody simply move to public cloud? Let's find out. So we're going to be looking at some of the use cases where public cloud is a complete no-no for a lot of these organizations. They simply cannot go to public cloud, right? Let's explore what those reasons are. And let's say, for example, they decide that, all right, this is the time to move to think about a world that exists outside of public cloud. But what are some of those challenges for these customers who are exploring the journey outside of the public cloud, right? So let's hash out on that. um, and then let's also explore what is that's on the table, how Microsoft is trying to solve some of customers challenges who are trying to explore the world outside of Azure or any public cloud, for example. So in this, typically we're going to be looking at what is Microsoft's hybrid approach. Talking about hybrid approach, there's a very, very critical component to that, and this session is going to be purely focused on that particular product. It's called Azure Stack HCI. So I'll probably talk about a little more about the history of the evolution of the product and so on and so forth. So most of you may be familiar with this product already. And then the big question is now, how do customers, let's say, for example, if they decide that Microsoft is the best hybrid approach that's possible for our organization today, how do we help them make their dream a reality? How do we ensure they move some of these workloads either from public cloud or from an aging infrastructure that's running on premises to something known as Azure Stack HCI. So let's find out. And also, we're going to be delving a little at a high level on what are some of those benefits that Microsoft is trying to extend those customers who are trying to modernize their on-premise infrastructure, or maybe trying to repatriate some of the workloads from other public clouds to on-prem. Let's see what those benefits are. And lastly, I'm going to show you a demo, but I'm afraid I don't have a great news for the demo, which I thought, I usually depend on live demos. Okay, I don't believe in recordings because they suck. But just realized my Austin lab network is down for some reason. But anyways, I should still be able to kind of guide you through what that process is. So we should have some demo going. All right, now, why do we really care about Azure today? So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with or keep in, in terms of the market data, in terms of what's the market share for Microsoft Azure. It's close to about 21%, right? AWS is hovering around 32 to 33%. I think it's gone up by about 33 to 34, I think, if I'm not wrong. But Azure is growing faster than any other public cloud out there, right? It's the number 2 public cloud today, and very soon, fingers crossed, Microsoft Azure may become the biggest public cloud vendor, right? I don't see that not happening. So the way Azure is growing today. Now, if you look at Azure, Azure has about 70 plus data center regions, right? So every time I talk about this slide, there'll be a few more, regions that get added up. So I always get mixed up on the number, but that's how fast Azure is really growing, right? In fact, there's one that's coming up in Indonesia. There's one recently announced for Hyderabad as well. So you have a lot of these Azure regions, coming up in a jiffy. So the best part is, Azure has more data center regions than AWS and Google combined, right? But the big question is, do really customers care about so many Azure regions? Well, Azure region is down, down the road, or maybe it's somewhere around the corner, right? No, not necessarily, right? For example, there are a lot of customers who are geographically located somewhere else, or maybe their industries. For example, think about a shipping industry, right? They're pretty much businesses operated out of the middle of the shipping ocean, right? Middle of the ocean. Or a mining industry, for example. These mines are located, hundreds and thousands of kilometers away from the corporate headquarters, right? Any of these locations, or manufacturing, for example. So we call that as the intelligent edge, right? Well, we call it as edge, but how do we make that as an intelligent edge? That's the big question, right? So that's what we are trying to solve. Now, what you're seeing here is a beautiful analysis that's done by Flexera. I usually get tuned into Flexera to understand what's going on in this world, especially around the infrastructure side. This is the latest report, 2023. So every year they release this report. Now, according to them, about close to about 87% of the organizations have a multi-cloud strategy. So what is multi-cloud? So basically, they are invested not just in a one cloud, which is basically a public cloud. They're invested in multiple private clouds, hybrid cloud, which is somewhere in between, right? So a lot of customers that I talk to and say, what do you really mean about cloud and how does that really resonate to you, right? So cloud is really not the destination. It's basically an operating model that customers choose as to how they want to operate. For example, the rush that we saw for the last maybe a decade, where everybody was running into the public cloud, the reason being, it is so much easier. For example, let's say if I want to start a company tomorrow, it's so much easier for me to just subscribe to AWS or Azure and spin up my resources in no time, right? I don't need that initial infrastructure cost, which otherwise I would need millions of dollars or maybe thousands of dollars if I'm a smaller company. just to set up that IT back, IT infrastructure on premises, right? It involves a lot of investment as well. So that's what really made the public cloud a game changer. Now, if you look at organizations today, they're slowly starting to realize, wait a minute, I've been running into the public cloud. Now, public cloud is not the de facto destination for me or for their end customers. The reason being, could be a number of reasons as to why, public cloud may become a deterrent for a lot of these organizations, right? Think about, like I said, edge use cases where they absolutely have no connectivity in the middle of the ocean or somewhere in the mining field. There's absolutely no internet connection. They can't simply connect to the internet, right? But they want a cloud operating model there. They can't get the cloud operating model today. If they have to run anything on premises, they have to run on an age-old infrastructure. And as you know, all of these infrastructure, they really cannot match with the innovation of public cloud, right? That's one of the biggest barriers today for any innovation that happens on premises. But then, given the challenges that these customers face day in and day out, these are not just the edge locations only, right? There are so many countries, like, for example, India or Southeast Asia, for example, many geographical locations, even in Australia. There are so many organizations are not happy about moving something to the public cloud. Take, for example, any government organization or any financial institution. They are very apprehensive about somebody managing their infrastructure because they're also, tapping onto their critical and very sensitive data as well, which these organizations are very, very apprehensive about. So these industries are increasingly looking at, wait a minute, I don't want to give anything a free hand to my data in a public cloud where I can't feel and touch. So this is where they're increasingly coming to industries, technology companies like Microsoft or Dell or Google or any of these big companies and say, can you help me modernize my on-premise infrastructure, but I want to keep my data and applications, in my location. It cannot leave the country of origin. So these are some of the use cases, right? The other use cases that we see, especially post-COVID, is every organization there went berserk, enabling remote connected workplace, right? Which has become a huge thing even today. Even though some organizations are calling people back to office, but still they see a significant value, especially in a remote connected working methodology. For example, I always work remotely. It works beautifully for me. So ain't broken, don't fix it. So it's, my organization doesn't want to fix anything because it works beautifully. I have a lot of time to myself, not just to myself, but also to my family, right? So now some of the merits of remote working has really benefited a lot of these organizations, and they really quickly want to enable virtual desktop infrastructure on premises. That's running on-prem, not from public cloud, but running on-prem. The reason being, they want to have low latency. For example, think about let's say I'm based in Sydney. I have the closest Azure data center region in Sydney. Let's say if I were to be based out of Queensland somewhere, I have a very poor connection with Azure, right? For me, that connection simply doesn't work. So I need to have something that's running in Queensland where I can just go and access it with low latency. And so is the case. The second one is the biggest one, as every organization today is after reaping the benefits of data. And these data are getting generated outside of conventional data centers. It's outside of public clouds. It's outside of conventional data centers, but it's actually happening somewhere at the far edge. Now, according to IDC, the recent survey, they say by 2025, 70% of the total data growth is expected to be originated at the edge. I mean, these are mind-boggling numbers, right? If you just think about it, the amount of data growth that is expected, come next year, it's already happening. By next year, we're going to have 70% of data growth, witnessed at the edge, right? That's significant. That's one of the reasons why all of these big companies are thinking a world outside of their public cloud because it's happening right now. The reason why I say that is because I day in and day out interact with you name the kind of industry, pretty much every industry in all of APJ, right? Be it mining, be it retail, or be it any government institutions. I deal with multiple organizations. The one story which they all tell me is, hey, Jayant, how do I move some of my infrastructure that's running in the public cloud to on-prem and make sure that my on-premise infrastructure is matured enough and keeps cadence with the public cloud, right? So that's the biggest ask for many of these customers. Now, the other challenge that they run into is also about not just moving workloads from public cloud to on-premises, but also increasingly most of these companies are looking to modernize their applications as well. Be it a transactional database, for example, SQL managed instance, you consume SQL database. You don't really care about what's the operating system that's powering the database, right? That's the beauty about SQL database as a managed service. You go to Azure, you don't care about who is actually managing the infrastructure that's hosting SQL DB, but you just make a connect to SQL database instance, and that's it. That's exactly what you need. And they want a similar experience even on-prem. So how do we make that happen? And then extend Azure to the edge. So they want some of the Azure services which are running in public Azure. They want the similar Azure services, for example, Azure App Service, Azure Functions, or Log Analytics Workspace. So you name it, right? There's so many services that are available in public cloud, but some of them, they want to kind of make it available to the far edge where they couldn't have reached. For example, AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop. By the way, Azure Virtual Desktop is the second biggest workload that runs in public Azure today, right? Just goes, that's something that they want to run on-prem as well. Like I said, many of these organizations, they're after one thing. One is they want to optimize the cost. Every organization that I speak to, they are after, how do I reduce my operational expenditure? That's one single goal, the biggest goal these organizations have, along with their intention to stay in a compete situation. The reason I say compete situation is because every industry today is modernizing their applications. If they don't modernize their applications, they know that they're going to fall behind. In fact, there's a very famous saying, right? In another 10 years, every organization is going to be a digital enterprise. Simple, right? Because they'd have to be. Think about AWS, for example, right? How AWS was maybe 10 years back. The way they are today, they're actually a digital company. So every startup that happens, they want to be a digitally ahead of the rest, right? That's where the concept of native, cloud native, building cloud native application containers come in really handy. So they want those kind of experiences that are already available in public cloud to on-prem. So let's see what options we have there. Like I spoke about, what are some of the challenges? So especially this is for organizations who are trying to, hey, wait a minute, there's a world that's outside of public cloud. Because my end customers want the applications and data to remain on the premises. Now, the problem with that approach is, how do I manage? Now, I have a lot of these infrastructure that's running in AWS. Some of them are running in public Azure, some of them in GCP, some of them in a private cloud, some of them in a hybrid cloud. Some of them are age-old infrastructure, which requires, just think about the permutations and combinations the IT organizations has to meddle with on a day-to-day basis, just trying to manage this disparate infrastructure, right? It's humongous. So this is where every organizations are after, right? How do I help me reduce the management complexity? And then also about very limited visibility to the multi-cloud, right? When I say limited visibility, what does that mean? For example, as an organization, I have no clue unless I have skill sets to see what's running in AWS, because I'm an Azure guy. I don't have a skill set to actually manage an AWS instance or infrastructure in AWS. And the same thing goes with AWS engineers as well. They have no clue what's going on on Azure or GCP or even on premises. And on premises guy have absolutely no clue what you're talking about from a public cloud language. So these guys are totally confused, and it gives them very, very less visibility from an organization perspective as to get a single kind of pane of glass kind of an experience where I can manage all my disparate IT assets, very easily. That simply, doesn't happen today. But let's see how Microsoft is trying to solve that bigger challenge. Unpredictable cloud costs. Now, if you see most organizations, like I said, cost is the biggest driver for any organization that wants to modernize or think about alternate strategies, right? And unpredictable cost is the biggest thing. Today, I'm not sure how many of you know shadow IT. So shadow IT is you just spin up a virtual machine in the public cloud and you forget about it. Tell me what happens. It's like opening your tap water, leaving it without shutting it down, right? It drains the entire water completely, right? Water tank. So that's exactly what is happening, especially the cloud spend in terms of wastage is close to about 30%. So every organization is facing about 30% of cloud spend, which is turning out to be a wastage, and they're trying to see how they can reduce that. So that's why there are so many companies being born, new companies saying, I can do cloud management for you and all of that, right? So that's where you see a huge spike because every company wants to save cost. Skill gaps, like I spoke about, every organization has this problem. And the biggest one is inconsistent in terms of security posture, right? So you have some kind of governance in Azure. There are some set of security tools in Azure, and there's totally different set of security tools in AWS, on-premises, edge locations, and private cloud. And how do you really acquire so many skill sets? You need to talk about security. You need to talk about management skill set. There are so many things to bother about for an organization, right? So this is turning out to be a real pain point, right? So this is where Microsoft kind of has realized all these challenges, and they're trying to see how we can solve customer challenges. So, and the answer to all this challenge is thankfully, so we have something known as the Microsoft hybrid portfolio, which is called Azure Stack HCI. So I know the name can be a little confusing, but Azure Stack is a product portfolio in itself from Microsoft. So you can just go to portal.azure.com. You can see Azure Stack HCI is a native resource that's running. It's one of the other 100+ services that run in Azure in public Azure. So I'm going to come to that. Why is that running in public Azure? Stay tuned. But Azure Stack HCI is nothing but it's a rebranded version of Windows Server Storage Spaces Direct. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with WSSD way back in 2016. So WSSD was the first software-defined data center product from Microsoft, which is in terms of operating system. That supported hyperconverged infrastructure. So those of you who are not familiar with hyperconverged infrastructure, I don't want to spend too much time here, but hyperconverged infrastructure basically abstracts all of that and makes the resources available to the software. So basically it's software defined. So think about, I'll probably give you a quick example. Let's say in the olden days, people used to have 3-tier architecture. It used to be called SAN. There used to be a network at the top of the layer, and then you have compute and storage, right? All of these things are totally different products, but they have to be managed independently. So you obviously require independent skill sets. The biggest downside is each of these hardware were supplied by a specific vendor. For example, Cisco supplied the switches, and then Dell or HP supplied the servers, and storage was provided by, let's say, EMC and so on and so forth, right? So not necessarily all these companies came together to build something like a solution, right? So customer ran into a lot of issues. For example, if they had to scale up something, they didn't know whether it's going to work or not, right? That's one of the biggest downsides of 3-tier SAN architecture, right? So that's where hyperconverged infrastructure really came to the limelight, right? Because it was all abstracted into a single box. So you have a one new server, you have compute, you have storage, you have networking, and everything is managed by the operating system, which has software-defined storage, software-defined networking, software-defined compute, and so on and so forth. For example, Hyper-V or ESXi. So that powered the entire thing. Life became so much simpler to deploy an HCI infrastructure rather than a 3-tier SAN. So that's exactly how public Azure today is being powered, right? It's powered by a bunch of HCI nodes that make life so much easier for every one of us who are invested in public cloud like Azure. So the best part about Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI, make no mistake, I referenced about Windows Server Storage Spaces Direct, which is nothing but an operating system, right? Which is a Windows Server operating system. So make no mistake, Azure Stack HCI is still an operating system. It's still running on Windows kernel, right? But what it's done is it's kind of derivative of Windows Server. So if you look at Windows Server today, a lot of customers use Windows Server for a lot of the services that come pre-built with Windows Server. For example, DHCP services, DNS, print services, file services, Active Directory, you name it. There are so many services that come with it, right? But Azure Stack HCI was branched out version of Windows Server that was purposely built to solve the virtualization needs of customers. So when I say virtualization needs, those customers who just simply want to spin up a virtual machine or build a hypervisor, just like ESXi, for example. So what's powering is the Hyper-V. So all they did is they made Azure Stack HCI the best virtualization host or a host OS, and then Windows Server the best guest operating system, right? So that's where the goal of Microsoft is right now. So they are seriously ahead of Azure Stack HCI, which can help customers transform their existing estate running on a 3-tier SAN into a hyper-converged infrastructure, which is a modern way of doing compute and storage, which is software defined, plus give that additional ability so they can integrate with Azure as well. This is a game changer. Think about organizations today, right? They're invested in public cloud. Yes. Now they're looking to modernize their on-prem infrastructure. Now you're asking them, hey, you know what? Just to manage your on-prem infrastructure, you have to use a different tool. Now that's going to be absolutely a no for many customers, right? Can you give me a single pane of glass? I want a single pane of glass. I want to manage Azure. I want to manage my on-prem infrastructure easily. That's exactly the answer from Azure Stack HCI. That's why you see this as delivered as an Azure service. That's why when you go to portal.azure.com, feel free to, as I'm speaking, feel free to open your Google, just go to portal.azure.com. I'm sure most of you may have access to Azure. Just search Azure Stack HCI. It's actually a service that's built into Azure. And then provide the option to basically scale their infrastructure right from a single node all the way to 16 nodes. That gives them ample amount of storage, ample amount of compute, ample amount of networking and all of that, right? So keep in mind there is no additional storage because it's an HCI. HCI is abstracted into a single unit. So you have a bunch of disks there in that server, maybe about 16. So for example, a Dell PowerEdge server can support up to 24 disks, right? That's a lot of storage. In fact, if you look at some of the storage that's available today, each drive, especially NVMe's, can support up to about 15 terabytes. That's a massive one, right? So you can put up, a single server I'm talking. So you can stack up to 16 nodes. But keep in mind, you will still be limited with 16 nodes because you can't scale like, for example, Azure. It's not infinite scaling that's available in Azure today, right? You're still limited, but make no mistake, most customers, right, they may not even exceed beyond 8 nodes. In fact, Microsoft did a research and the maximum deployment of Azure Stack HCI across all organizations globally is maximum is 8 nodes. And the percentage wise, 90% of the deployments are actually 2 to 4 nodes. Just goes to show how powerful these servers are today, right? So it's more than sufficient to power their on-premises needs. Let me just stop there. I know I've been speaking quite a lot. Are there any questions that you want me to address? Okay, cool. That sounds like no questions. All right. Now, this is what I said, right? So basically what customers today are looking at is looking to innovate their on-premise infrastructure, modernize them, and then plug it with Azure. So when I say plug it with Azure, do they really move workloads to Azure? No, they don't. Which in fact, all of the VMs, the virtual machines, you name it, containers, everything is running on these servers. For example, in this case, it's Dell Apex Cloud Platforms, which is a building block of Azure Stack HCI, which is a certified platform by Microsoft. So they're actually running on this hypervisor, but they're simply connected to Azure. Just connected. They surface into Azure, they show up in Azure, and those who are familiar with Azure Arc, they will probably you guys will definitely appreciate what I'm saying. So Azure Arc basically, binds the resources which are outside of Azure. So maybe you're running a VM that's running in AWS. You can still surface that VM. When I say surface, not move, you can only bring the metadata of that VM into Azure Construct by using Azure Arc. So Azure Arc, again, feel free to go ahead and search for Azure Arc. It's also one of the other services that is there in public Azure today. So that is the one which is chiefly responsible to bind a non-Azure resource. And that way, customers will get a single pane of glass kind of an experience. You will probably understand much better when I do the demo. All right, now I spoke a lot about what's the use case, why customers, what are some of the pain points of customers that run traditional on-premise infrastructure, and how Azure is trying to solve some of the challenges and all. How does a typical hybrid infrastructure from a Microsoft perspective or even from a customer perspective look like? This is exactly what, so I'm going to let the slide populate itself. And this is exactly how a customer's day-to-day infrastructure powered by, let's say, a certified hardware partner like Dell, running Azure Stack HCI operating system on top of these hardware, and they're running as a cluster. For example, like I said, you can go up to 16 nodes cluster, if you want to. That's the amount. That's the maximum number of nodes that are supported. So these are physical servers, but they're deployed with Azure Stack. Each of them are deployed with Azure Stack HCI operating system. And then it creates this beautiful virtualization layer, which is not only software defined in terms of storage, so which means it brings in all the storage capacities from independent servers. Say, for example, I said one of the nodes from Dell support up to 24 nodes. So you bring in 24 into 16. That's the total amount of storage that gets exposed. And not just that, right? It is exposed from a software endpoint. So there is nobody who is in between, like a person trying to assign logical units to each of the end users. No, it just happens completely automated through the software, right? And so is the case with networking as well. So every resource that you can think of, compute, storage, networking, is presented at the virtualization layer for the operating system that can be used as a software, right? Now, on top of it, the best part about Azure Stack HCI is customers can run Windows VMs, like Linux VMs or whatever it is. They can also start containerizing these applications in the future. Now, think about most customers today. Most customers today are running traditional Windows servers, right? Traditional VMs, or sometimes even bare metal servers, because these guys were running on a 3-tier SAN, right? Which is basically an age-old infrastructure. But they're getting all of this they get the best of both worlds, which means they can lift and shift those VMs onto the new infrastructure, but also start thinking about modernizing them, because AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes Service, which is available today in public cloud, is also available on Azure Stack HCI. So it's the best of both worlds, right? You can bring as is infrastructure, also think about modernizing them in the future. And the best part is you can tie all of those Azure constructs just like you would for an Azure resource. Think about Azure Monitor, Azure Policies, Azure Insights, Defender, Azure Update Manager, you name it, Azure Tagging. So they can bring in all of those Azure constructs into these resources, which make it feel like, oh, you know what? These are native resources that are running in public Azure. They're not really outside. For anybody who's just managing the resources, it feels like they all belong to Azure, but not really. Some of these resources are running on Azure Stack HCI outside of Azure. That's the magic that the combination of Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI brings to the customer table. If I were to be an organization looking at this, getting a holistic view of not just my Azure resources, but resources that run outside of Azure, including a virtual machine that's running in AWS or GCP, it's a game changer, right? I can apply those Azure policy constructs, Defender, you can baseline my security. Remember, one of the challenges which I called out is inconsistency in security challenges, right? So I can make a consistent security standards across all of these disparate IT estates. All right, now moving on. How does really one migrate anything from existing infrastructure to, let's say, Azure Stack HCI? So, which is basically, so first conversation that you will normally receive is, how do I move from on-prem modernize? But are really customers looking at moving workloads from Azure to on-prem? Absolutely. You know, I was at the Microsoft MVP Summit last week in Redmond. And when I told them, look, this is what is happening, everybody joined hands and said, exactly, customers are moving away from public cloud. And what's the biggest reason? Reason is cost. Like I said, a lot of cloud spend is going as wastage. They don't know how to manage resources. They just landed in a state where probably they were never destined to, right? And they probably ended up realizing, oh my God, wait a minute, maybe I should not have moved my workload to public cloud. I should have remained on-prem. So lot of customers are thinking, how do I repatriate workloads from public Azure? So if you've seen the latest Azure announcement, there is no egress cost. They've removed egress cost. I think pretty much most of the public cloud vendors. So there's no egress cost now. There was never an ingress cost, but there was an egress cost. The moment you said, I want to pull resources out of Azure, Microsoft went, wait a minute, you can't just pull it out like that. You have to pay a particular fee. Now there is no fee because it's happening right now. And a lot of customers are moving. So there are a number of tools that are available, including third-party tools like, for example, Carbonite, VM, Commvault, you name it. There's so many things. Azure Migrate is a de facto tool. A lot of customers, especially lifting from on-prem to public cloud, Azure Migrate was the de facto tool, right? So now Azure Migrate is under investigation if they should really enable moving the workload from public Azure to on-prem. So the reverse, right? So very interesting, but it's a great use case there. Migration from aging infra. So by default, right? Every customer, like I said, are invested in a 3-tier SAN, but they're also trying to see what are some of the benefits will I get apart from, let's say, single pane of glass, which is great. But what are some of the migration options that are available? So these are the questions a lot of these customers are asking, right? So there are a number of migration options today, especially if you're moving from, horizontally. When I say horizontally, basically from one technology, let's say VMware to Azure Stack HCI. So today, Azure Migrate supports VMware to Azure Stack HCI, but keep in mind, it's in private preview, but very soon it will go public preview. But Hyper-V to Azure Stack HCI is still supported. Hyper-V is a traditional 3-tier SAN, so you can move VMs from Hyper-V into Azure Stack HCI, so that's supported. Now, the biggest question, right? What about VMware? VMware literally ruled the roost, as we all know, for the last 10 years. They were the market leaders. They literally ruled everything, right? They had close to about 70% market share. Would you believe that? That's the kind of monopoly VMware had, especially on the enterprise and any segment, for example, on virtualization. Now, there are a lot of uncertainties about Broadcom acquisition. I'm not sure if you are solution architects, you speak to customers on a day-to-day life, which I do. In fact, all my conversations, 9 out of 10 conversations that I have with customers are looking for alternate solutions because of Broadcom acquisition. So which means they're apprehensive about acquisition. Secondly, the cost of VMware has gone up dramatically, right? Everything is made as subscription-based. That's also a concern. All right, so now Microsoft has to, beat the iron when it's really hot. And that's exactly what they're doing right now. So what they're doing is, all right, I really want to capitalize on the existing scene that's happening with VMware or customers trying to look outside of public cloud and all of that, which is great. But how do I really capitalize on monetizing this opportunity, right? That's exactly what they're trying to do. But at the same time, they're also extending some of these benefits to customers. So making their lives easier as well. So it's kind of Microsoft is playing a beautiful game of win-win, not just for them, but also for their customers, which means we are making their overall cost journey very simple. So they call this as hybrid benefit. So today, if you look at Azure Stack HCI, I'm just going to get into the licensing part of it, just a cost conversation a little bit. Today, if you look at Azure Stack HCI, there's a host fee associated with it, which means customers have to pay $10 per physical core. So which means every server will have 2 CPUs generally. Let's say, for example, you bring in 24 CPU. So you have 2 CPUs. Totally, you get about 48 CPUs. And then they have to pay about $480 per core per month, per core, right? So, I mean, in total, they have to pay about $480 per month, not 480 per core per month, but basically $10 per core. So which translates to 480. So that's a lot of money, right? Still a lot of money. Imagine if they have 10 servers like that, which translates to about 4,800, 480 cores, which translates to about $4,800. That's a significant amount of money. And that gets billed against an Azure subscription. Is there a way around it? Of course there is. This is what is attracting many customers, which means most customers will have this. If you talk to customers, they will say, I will have Windows Server Data Center or enterprise agreement with software assurance. I can bring in those software assurance cores, exchange those cores against Azure Stack HCI, which means you need to pay $0. Awesome, isn't it? So for a customer who's paying $480, has all of a sudden has to pay $0 because he's exchanging which he already has in his organization, which is basically the software assurance course. So what are some of the benefits? The first one is the host fee, like I spoke about. Windows Server unlimited virtualization on Azure Stack HCI. So what does this mean? Windows Server, for example, let's say you have Windows Server Data Center. You also have an option to buy Windows Server Data Center with unlimited guest VM licensing. So which means when you apply the same licensing on Azure Stack HCI, you get completely free. And the last one is AKS. AKS is free on Azure Stack HCI as well. So those customers who are trying to modernize, for them it's free. And the best one is, let's say, for example, you have an age-old Windows Server, like Windows Server 2012, or very soon to be end of life. I think end of life for Windows Server 2016 is coming soon, but Windows Server 2012 is already end of life. Now, for those customers, you can lift and shift those Azure workloads onto Azure Stack HCI and get 3 years of free extended security updates. Mind-boggling. I know a customer who saved $40 million just by moving to Azure Stack HCI because there was a saving of $40 million by moving Azure workloads into Azure Stack HCI. Huge. All right, so how much time do we have? So I know we have 12 minutes. I know it's a good amount of time for me to showcase, do some demos. Before that, I want to see if there are any questions on the chat or. Okay, absolutely no questions. That's great.
If you
Okay, any
check in
questions
the
who wants to
Q&A
come? Yeah.
session, there is somebody has Saad have asked a question. It
Okay.
should be in the Q&A section.
Okay, I will just go there. 1 second. All right. Will Azure play any role on blockchain, or what is the plan of Microsoft Azure for WB3? I'm not an Azure expert, Saad, but that's a great question. Anybody from Azure may be able to help you out here, but this is purely an on-premises play, which is Azure Stack HCI. If your question is, does Azure Stack HCI support blockchain? Not yet. There is a roadmap that I'm aware of, but not yet in Azure Stack HCI. I'm not too sure about blockchain in Azure. Maybe somebody else can pick that up. Okay. Any other question? Sorry, I see a hand up by someone. All right. Metahul, do you want to? He has a question, I think. Siraj, you want to unmute him or?
Is he requesting for the mic access?
Yeah. Hello, Mike. Okay. You should be able to speak now.
Sir, when I get my certificate?
What's that?
When I get my certificate?
If it's about certificate, I will respond in the chat box. If it's not the related session, then I can respond to in the chat box.
All right, there's one other hand up that I see. Okay, I will allow Mike. Okay, Ibidapo, do you have a question? I have allowed you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning. Yes, we have Azure subscription in my office, and I have some VMware. Oh, sorry, I have some servers on on-prem, and I've been using Windows admin manager,
Admin Center.
Admin Center, yes. So presently, I upgraded to Windows Server 2022, and I try to let's say add or implement Azure Hack, but I'm being confused. I've tried to check if I'm going to be paid. I'm going to be charged for is it implementing Azure Hack, and I've been trying on several occasions to access my on-prem server in the cloud, but
That's
it's
a
not
good
possible.
question.
So I'm just trying to see how can I access my on-prem applications also, or access my on-prem server that is on the Arc, on the
That's
cloud.
a great question.
On the yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So your concern is whether Microsoft is going to charge you just because you enabled that server using Azure Arc, right? Now, the first question is, for enabling Azure Arc, you won't be charged. It's completely free, right? But if you start applying Azure resources, say, for example, Azure Defender for Cloud, let's say you enable Azure Insights, Azure Monitor, or Update Manager. Let's say you try to do an update onto that Azure Stack, onto that Windows server. That's when you get charged by Azure. But just for surfacing that to Azure, you won't be charged.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
All right, cool. Thank you. I think probably we'll give about 3 or 4 minutes before towards the end so that you guys can ask questions. Okay, I can allow any other questions. Okay, good. All right, so let me just quickly share my screen and show you how this all looks. Okay. Okay, cool. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Now I'm in portal.azure.com. So like I said, Azure Stack HCI is a native Azure resource, right? Now, before I go into Azure Stack HCI, I will come to Azure Arc. I think one of the gentlemen asked me a beautiful question about what happens if I surface something into Azure, right? So what does Azure Arc really do? So what Azure Arc does is basically it stitches a non-Azure resource into Azure. Okay, so which means you're not really moving that workload into Azure, but it's making that connection from public Azure to wherever it is residing, right? Like he said, he has deployed Windows Server on-prem. He's trying to surface that into Azure. So Windows Server will continue to run on-prem, but it shows up in Azure. So that's called an infrastructure, right? So basically you can build or you can bring in any infrastructure. It could be a machine or it could be a host, anything, right? So just say, click on add machine. You can bring a single server at a time. I mean, think about organizations, right? They will have thousands of VMs running outside of Azure. And if they want to do that, they can bring in multiple servers at a time. So basically what this does is if you go through this thing, it'll ask you for a resource group, just a normal conversation that you do, region, you need to pick a region for it, and then it'll generate a script. And you take that script, run that script on the VM or the physical server, wherever it is residing, run that script. It's basically a PowerShell script. And then it'll deploy an agent known as Azure Connected Machine Agent. And then that starts building a connection with Azure. And once that's built up, you will see if you go under Azure, if you go under machines, it starts showing up just like this. For example, there's a Windows 11 VM that's running outside of Azure, and it's already showing up here, right? So that's one part. Now, let's go to Azure Arc again. So go to infrastructure. Likewise, just like you're bringing in, it could be anything. It doesn't have to be just Windows, right? It can be a Linux VM as well. In fact, I had just check out my YouTube channel. It's called Giant on Cloud. So maybe I can just bring that up here. YouTube. Oh, maybe I think I will. Okay, so sorry. All right, so if you go to my YouTube channel, all right, so it's called Giant on Cloud. If somebody wants to make a note of it, feel free to. There are a lot of conversations that I have been doing, tons of videos. And one of the videos is Azure Stack, Azure Arc, explaining about what Azure Arc is. In fact, I've surfaced one of the VMs that was actually running in AWS into Azure and managing that VM, just like I'm managing an Azure VM, right? So, feel free to subscribe as well. So there's a ton of demos, all live demos and everything. So, feel free to check that out. All right, cool. So let's go back to the Azure part. Likewise, you can also bring in, let's say, for example, Kubernetes clusters or VMware or SCVMM or Azure Stack HCI in this case. In addition to that, you can also have services. For example, let's say you have a SQL server that's running on-prem or a SQL managed instance, Postgres. All of these are different services that get exposed as well. Okay. All right, so let me hurry up. There's just 3 minutes to go. Now, the biggest one is Azure Stack HCI. So when you create an Azure Stack HCI cluster, right, the first step is to, after the deployment, let's say after you've created the cluster, the first step is to register that against an Azure subscription. So once you register, it starts showing up here. For example, if I go into all clusters, you see, okay, the reason why I said, just before the start of this event, I lost connection in the lab, because of which this lab is actually in Austin, Texas. Unfortunately, I lost the connection to this, but however, I can still show you, metadata on whatever is available. So basically, there are a couple of nodes that are running, which is basically Azure Stack HCI Node 1 and Node 2, which is running in Austin data center. And they have surfaced this into Azure, and they show up as an Azure cluster, right? So I can apply any of the Azure constructs. For example, the reason why it doesn't show up here is because of the because it's disconnected. But I can tie in any of those Azure, constructs into those VMs. For example, policies or updates, inventory tracking, Azure Insights. These are all invaluable Azure resources or Defender for Cloud. Like I said, the moment you start enabling any of these features, you get charged. It's not a free feature, but just for showing up in Azure, it does not cost a thing. One last thing that I want to show you is how do I create a VM on Azure Stack HCI right from Azure portal. How beautiful is that, right? So now what I will do is, let's say I go into, okay. So you go to virtual machines and I say, I created actually 2 VMs. These VMs are running, you see this? It's not in the Azure location. It's actually in a custom location called Azure Stack HCI. I can actually create an Azure Stack and a VM right from Azure, but this VM gets deployed in Austin Lab. Very powerful, isn't it? So that's the power of using public Azure, because as you can see, customers are getting a single pane of glass. Imagine when you have, in my case, I just have one cluster. Typically in a customer scenario, they have thousands of clusters. Okay, I can even do update management. For example, I can extend the, for example, let's say I want to do update all the operating system updates across all clusters. Doesn't matter where they're located. I can do that right from the Azure Update Management feature, right? So that's the power of really marrying the entire on-premise infrastructure into Azure Control Plane. Likewise, you can also bring in, surface any non-Azure resources. It could be a virtual machine or any container distribution. As long as it's CNCF certified, you can surface them into Azure Arc. Cool. All right, so I know we are over time, but I'm happy to kind of stay along just to see if there are any questions at all. I'm more than happy to answer. I'm coming from industry experience, so any questions are welcome. So feel free to ask me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Sorry, was there a Q&A? Will Azure play any role? Okay, that's beyond. Okay, sir, what will be the process when Microsoft Azure handling data loss situations due to damaged hardware? Okay, that's a great question, Charaka. What happens when Microsoft Azure handling? Okay, there is an SLA even for Azure Stack HCI. The beauty about Azure Stack HCI is it has a feature known as triple way mirror. So which means you have, let's say, for example, you have 4 nodes, right? One node is kept as a reserved node, while the data is actually distributed across 2 different nodes, which means you have the overall efficiency of Azure is actually 33%. Okay, the Azure Stack HCI. So which means even if a single node goes down or even a second node goes down, you still have the data backup and running. The beauty is even when single node goes down, there is a lot of alerting that happens immediately. In fact, a support ticket gets created at the Dell backend. If you go with Dell, because Dell, is obviously the #1 hardware partner when it comes to hardware. So it gets created and somebody from Dell will call the customer and say, we saw a node failure, so we're going to fix that issue, right? So very, very rare where customers will lose all 3 nodes at the same time. That doesn't happen. But at the same time, they can do a number of things also. For example, they can build disaster recovery plans, like they can replicate virtual machines into Azure as well, right? Let's say, for example, they don't trust on-prem hardware, they can replicate it to public Azure, so they still have the data up and running. Or they can do disaster recovery between the 2 sites. Let's say, for example, Sydney and Melbourne. You can have clusters between Sydney and Melbourne replicating and talking to each other. So even if one side goes down, you still have the other side up and running. So there are a number of DR plans that are already baked into the solutions. So it's completely up to the customer's appetite and obviously dollars. All right, so there's one question. Thank you so much, Takeda, for subscribing to my channel. For data which requires to stay for 1 month only due to compliance to cloud, but we require to migrate data on 30th day to on-premises database, how it can be possible? So yeah, it is possible. There are a number of migration tools that are available today. For example, if it's a database, you can enable SQL replication, right? You build a SQL server on-prem on Azure Stack HCI. You have a SQL server running in public Azure. You can build SQL Server replication methodologies to replicate the data. That's one method. Or if you want to completely back that entire VM, you have backup technologies available. You can back them up into Azure, or you can also move those VMs into Azure as well using third-party tools like VM, Commvault. There are so many tools that are available. Yep, those things are realistic and they happen every day in customers' environment. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Anybody wants to come off mute, please raise your hand. Maybe just we'll give 1 more minute before we call it a day. All right, I see a hand up. All right, sir, Mr. Saad, you can speak. Saad, you can speak now. I think you have access. Okay.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So basically, to be honest, I'm very new to this cloud platform. I don't know much about that, but I know the providers, AWS, Azure, and I know about Azure for quite a lot of time, but in general, my knowledge about cloud is very little. So I would like to know where should I start if I want to get my foot in the industry, or if I'm seeing or switching my career to this route. Just a quick guideline if you can give me.
Okay, maybe my YouTube channel. I'm just joking. So,
yeah,
but
I
yeah,
subscribe.
But to be very honest, I did the exact same exercise just to benefit a number of people like you, for example, who are trying to aspiring to see how do I really think about what is hybrid, right? If you look at my YouTube channel, that's where I start from. What is a hybrid cloud? What is a necessity for somebody to even think about hybrid cloud, right? So basically start from the...
You were saying then, yeah, so yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so, but having said that, look, there are so many resources that are available, right? Microsoft, you just go to Microsoft and say Azure Stack HCI. There is learn.microsoft.com. It gives you beautiful guidelines on what the product is all about, why hybrid cloud, what are some of the use cases, just the way that I explained right now. So yeah, it's all there. There are a ton of resources.
Can this be this knowledge be enough to just like get a role of a cloud-based any position, or like if I say the knowledge about cloud, like many people associate if I talk about blockchain or smart contract, because I'm currently searching about those. So people generally say that you should do web development first. It will be easier. So is there any prerequisite for cloud?
Okay, so look, in my opinion, there are 2 different paths, right? The path that I am in is purely into infrastructure. And if you look
Yeah.
at Azure certification in general,
Yeah.
it guides you in two different paths. One is you can pick up infrastructure path, which is basically start from AZ 900, which is the foundational building block of what cloud technology is. And then you start working towards Azure Solution Architect 104 and so on and so forth, right? Likewise, they have a developer technology as well, right? You start with what, AZ 900, and then you go into the developer stream, for example, DevOps. That's where you start learning GitOps and GitHub and whatnot, right? So completely it's up to you what domain that you want to choose. I don't know whether there are enough handful number of people who have chosen both the industries, which is very hard to keep up. So
Quite
I would,
hectic. I can feel that. Yeah.
right. So I would pick the best path forward and pick the routes.
Yeah, maybe it's because of my knowledge. I cannot differentiate. Like, I'm not able to differentiate right now. Yeah. So
No, absolutely. I know there are a lot of people like you who are trying to explore and say. In fact, I'm guiding my son in the same direction, right? So he's
Oh,
also trying to explore what to do. He's around 16 years now, but thankfully I'm kind of exposed to all these things, so I kind of know. So I'm helping him out. But the truth, yeah, the truth is, that's the way you actually branch out, right? So you first figure out what your strengths are and what your
Yeah.
passion is. Don't go where the industry is moving, but follow your intuition, follow what you want to do.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It was nice talking to you, sir.
My pleasure. All right, so I think sorry guys, we're over time right now. Sirak, over to you.
Thank you, Chen, for the session. I think it was really helpful, and we were able to help somebody who is getting started, and a couple of answers answered. And if there is any question after the session, please do ask in the community. There is going to be somebody who is able to help you with that. And I also shared the certificate link in the chat box and our community links if in case anybody is here who is not yet there. And again, thanks for Jan for taking the time. And I know he's a really busy person, have a lot of talks, a lot of work, and he still made time to come in here and talk for us and share his knowledge. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for joining with us. And yeah, that's it for the day. And any last word from Jayant?
That's about it. I'm happy to help out anyone. Feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can look me up on Jayant on Cloud. Maybe I can just pop that up. Sorry. I will drop the LinkedIn link as well. I should have done this much before. Yeah, there you go. That's my LinkedIn profile. And that's also I'll also paste my YouTube channel just in case people are interested. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Happy to connect. Happy to help any one of you. I'm always open. That's one of my jobs. Being an MVP is to enable the community and help the community out. So, feel free to reach out. I'll be more than happy to help you guys. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, everyone.